In this video, we break down the real story behind Sound of Freedom and the darker system behind it. Not just how these operations happened, but why children could still fall through the cracks even when authorities knew the danger was real.
So please, why don't you walk us through what you know and help me understand and everybody watching and listening exactly what you think is going on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jordan. We're so grateful you take your time to do this with us. So I spent 12 years as a special agent, undercover operator with the Department of Homeland Security. Most of my time, 90% of that time, was spent investigating these cases, child crimes, child trafficking. And in fact, those numbers are correct that are being, these are Department of Labor, UN, these are sources that, the best we have that say that there's close to 6 million children or more who are forced into sex slavery, labor slavery, or organ harvesting.
The Department of Homeland Security is the federal agency tasked with protecting the United States from major security threats. And in this context, that includes investigating human trafficking and child exploitation through Homeland Security investigations. That means building cases, working undercover, coordinating with law enforcement, identifying victims, and trying to dismantle the networks moving children across borders and into exploitation before they disappear deeper into the system.
And I can attest that I have been involved in cases involving all three of those forms of slavery multiple times, and is a real thing. It's not even far from home. It's the United States is the #1 consumer year after year of child material, and oftentimes we're close to #1 in production. And it's a serious matter. You know, the case, the story in Sound of Freedom kicks off with the rescue of a little boy at the port of entry at the southern border. That's a real story, a real boy that I was on that port of entry. I was 10 years on the southern border. So when you have 85,000 unaccompanied minors showing up in the last 2 years, being let into the country without the sponsor being vetted, DNA checked, background checked, I call it the economy of pedophilia.
The case he is referring to involves a 5-year-old boy who was allegedly kidnapped by Earl Buchanan. Tim Ballard later described that rescue during testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Here's the clip.
I was the lead agent on. The trafficker was an American named Earl Buchanan. He kept children, both little boys and girls, in San Bernardino, California, where he lived, and where he repeatedly raped them and filmed it for his child pornography collection. On the night of July 3rd, 2006, Buchanan was attempting to smuggle a 5-year-old Mexican boy through the Calexico, California port of entry. Fortunately for the boy, he was coming from the Mexicali, Mexico region, which is blocked by miles and miles of significant border barriers. This compelled Buchanan to take his chances at the Calexico port of entry, where a U.S. officer had the opportunity to look Buchanan in the eye, detect that something was wrong, identify the child locked in the van, liberate that child, arrest Buchanan, who is now spending the rest of his life in jail.
Hearing real-world examples of this activity really is jarring. And this is happening right here in the U.S.
The United States, we're the demand. 85,000 children, thousands of them are under 5 years old, are let into the country. So we have a serious problem, and it's not being addressed as it should be. Hopefully this film can do that.
Tim, do you want to walk everybody listening through? Let's go back into the details of your life now.
So I worked for 12 years as a special agent and undercover operator for the Department of Homeland Security, the investigative division called Homeland Security Investigations. 10 of those years were spent on the border, tracking child traffickers, people who would exploit children with child exploitation material. So I really learned a lot. In 2006, the laws changed in the United States. And for the first time, U.S. agents were permitted and encouraged to go overseas and find children who Americans were abusing. And we could now hold those Americans accountable as if they had committed that crime on U.S. soil.
Ballard is likely compressing a few changes into one date here. The core legal shift began with the PROTECT Act, which gave the United States stronger authority to prosecute Americans who sexually abused children overseas. And by 2006, that authority was being reinforced by new federal child protection laws and a wider Justice Department crackdown on child exploitation. In other words, this was the period when these cases stopped being treated as something happening far away and started being treated as crimes the U.S. could actively hunt and prosecute.
That's what really changed my life, because I speak Spanish fluently, and they sent me overseas, south of the border. That's when my eyes opened up and I started seeing the children that I used to only see mostly on the child exploitation material cases. But it was tormenting me. The U.S. government unwittingly was, because if I couldn't find that connection back to the United States, the American kid or the American pedophile, I had to come home. But the problem is, I've already been exposed to the children. I've already been exposed to the problem, and oftentimes have made myself the bait. And in 2012, I had enough on this case. I kind of I went further than otherwise I probably should have. The movie didn't have time to tell you that there was another case in Haiti at the same time that I was working, thinking there was a US nexus. And I was told in both instances to come home and you couldn't work these cases.
What he is describing there is a jurisdiction problem. U.S. agents could pursue these cases overseas when there was a clear American connection, usually an American offender, an American-linked crime, or a federal charge the United States could actually bring. But without that nexus, the case largely belonged to the host country's authorities, which meant Ballard could see the children, understand the danger, and still be ordered to come home. To continue working the case, he would have to disobey orders and essentially quit his job.
And that's when I had a very consequential conversation with my wife. And I said, if I stay here, if I do this operation with or without my badge, it doesn't matter at this point. I can do the work. We will save kids. But I have to lose my job. And I was hoping my wife would have responded, get your ass home. First of all, you're going to die without the top cover of the U.S. government if you continue this. And who's going to pay the bills and feed the kids? She didn't say that. She said to me, you have to quit your job. And when she said those words, and I knew she meant those words, that changed everything for me. And we jumped into really just an irrational act of service, I might call it, because it wasn't rational in many ways. But ultimately, it ended in the operation you see depicted in the film.
What the film condenses into one dramatic rescue was, by later accounts, a larger coordinated Colombia operation called Operation Triple Take. The basic setup was months in the making. Ballard says Colombian authorities asked him to investigate reports that children were being sold into sex trafficking there, and the operation that followed involved undercover work, a rented location rigged with hidden cameras, coordination with Colombian law enforcement, and negotiations with traffickers who believed they were arranging access to children for wealthy buyers. CBS reported that the traffickers were allegedly luring children in through fake modeling opportunities, targeting them young, then preparing them to be sold a few years later.
How they find these kids is they lure them in by pretending to have a modeling agency. They target them at 9 or 10 years old. And they were telling us that about by 11, they're ready for sex. They're ready to be sold.
The raid that got the most attention at the time was the one dramatized most clearly in later retellings. According to CBS, less than 24 hours after the undercover operatives landed, suspected traffickers arrived for what had been set up as a sex party. Children and teenagers, some as young as 11, were brought in and told to wait while the deal was finalized. Ballard said the traffickers expected to make about $25,000 from that transaction. Instead, Colombian special operatives moved in and shut it down. CBS reported that 54 youths between 11 and 18 were rescued in that takedown, and 5 suspects were arrested, including a former beauty queen. The victims were then removed, medically evaluated, and placed into rehabilitation care. Operation Triple Take actually involved 3 coordinated operations in 3 different Colombian cities, not just one location, and the full result was 123 survivors liberated and 20 traffickers arrested. The island-style bust from the movie was only one piece of a larger synchronized effort unfolding across multiple cities at once. R also says one of the traffickers exposed in the wider network was a well-known local recruiter in Cartagena, remembered in its account as Miss Cartagena, someone who allegedly used status and trust to lure children away from families with false promises. So the short version is this: one takedown became the cinematic centerpiece. But the full operation was presented later as a multi-city coordinated strike that Auer describes as the biggest rescue mission it had carried out to that point.
But what the movie doesn't have the time to report is that in actuality it was 120. There was 2 other locations being taken down at the same time. And there's a documentary that's going to follow in the wake of Sound of Freedom called Triple Take. Angel Studios will put it out, documenting the entire story. And so in the end, it was successful, and we were able to build upon that success. And I founded Operation Underground Railroad. I run another foundation that was founded by Glenn Beck called the Nazarene Fund. And we're doing these kind of operations all over the world today.
The bigger story here was never just one rescue. It was the collision between trafficking, jurisdiction, bureaucracy, and the people who believed the system was not moving fast enough to stop it. This is Classified Context, where we break down difficult and often uncomfortable stories into clear, meaningful context. Drop a comment below and consider subscribing for more content.